We've heard a lot today. We've heard a lot from people, and we'll hear more tomorrow from people all over the world that are trying to change their communities, reform their communities, be it a complete democratic overhaul or in some cases more modest reforms, like ushering in more respect for fundamental human rights. The one thing, sadly, that so many of them have in common is prison. So many of them have been imprisoned. We heard from Dr. Yang-Jean Lee, and I noted one of the eager questions that was asked of him was, what was that experience like? It's something that few of us, sadly more of us in this room than in others, have some experience with, but it's something that now seems to be, it's not going away, and it's getting more and more prevalent. Imprisonment, arrest, and detention has become a chief tool by which regimes, in particular repressive regimes, look to silence its critics and curtail dissent. What's interesting about it is the tactic ultimately fails. It serves their more immediate purpose, which is to quiet any unrest at the moment. But what happens is when you take one person who's oftentimes a leader early on in these sort of in measures by regimes to quiet dissent, they often seek out the leaders and imprison them. And every time you take a community leader away, you inspire 5, 10 more. They're outraged by seeing one of their fellow activists imprisoned, and they themselves in turn become leaders. And then 10 years later, or hopefully sooner, one or more of them is released, and they go back to inspiring more people. And again, the people that they inspired are imprisoned and inspire others. So it becomes this revolving door, and with every rotation, it ultimately sows the seeds of revolution in that country. If you look at the Arab Spring, a lot of what outraged people in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria was the imprisonment of activists. And not just activists. The dragnet became much, much larger, and journalists were imprisoned, are imprisoned, lawyers are imprisoned. And this is why it's imprisonment that's the primary challenge for human rights defenders. Trying to keep themselves out of jail is really one of the hardest things, they can do. And in a lot of places, it ultimately becomes impossible. And this is why Freedom Now works on individual cases of prisoners of conscience. We believe, and I think all of us in this room believe, that it's the individual voices that transform communities and ultimately generate true reform in a country. And so it's critical then to support those individuals, because it's going to be those community leaders that are ultimately going to make the largest impact in their country. So how do you get someone out of jail, particularly in a country far away? It's difficult. Every country is different. A lot of the tactics used by countries are the same, but they're all different in their own way. And what we've found and what we pursue as a means to try to get people out of jail is a mix of legal, political, and public relations advocacy. Arguably, it's the latter two that are most critical. The legal efforts really help to reinforce the political advocacy. I'll speak briefly about the legal efforts because they are important. They're important for the primary reason that arbitrary detention is a function of international law. And so it's something that can be argued from that vantage point or the battleground of a court. And we try to work where we can in domestic courts as well as international venues. When you look at certain countries like Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan or Burma, China, it's kind of laughable, the thought that you would try to work through the domestic system. But it's become another battleground for us. For lawyers, it's become a battleground for trying to achieve human rights. After all, the government themselves are utilizing their police, they're utilizing their courts as another tool of persecution. So rather than just round people up and disappear them, although that still happens in cases as well, they will put them through show trials, which in some cases can be quite sophisticated. Some countries are definitely more savvy at fabricating charges. You might get, in certain countries, you get charges like undermining national security. In other countries like Syria, it's disseminating false information. That's a very common charge. And in others, drug charges, extortion, bribery. And we're seeing the countries become more and more sophisticated at drumming up evidence, air quotes, and bringing witnesses at trial, testifying to just outright lying. But it's still important to try to fight within that battleground. Since that government is trying to use that as a tool of persecution, you use it as a means or as an opportunity to fight back. And we do, with limited success, arguably no success. In some cases, we've helped work with local lawyers and helped get some charges dropped. But ultimately, if a government wants to imprison a human rights defender or an activist or a political activist, they will. In which case, you're really left with the international community. And that means finding venues to fight the regime internationally. And there's a few venues out there that can be incredibly effective and incredibly helpful, albeit only when coupled with political advocacy. Some of which are actually comprised under the Human Rights Council, itself a highly politicized body, but underneath it, there are what's called the special procedure branches, which include special rapporteurs on particular thematic issues, as well as working groups. And for our purposes, the chief working group is the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. And that's a body that hears individual cases and produces opinions on whether an individual is being arbitrarily detained. And it can be incredibly effective. Now, if the UN Working Group issues an opinion adverse to China, does that mean China complies with the order and releases the individual? I don't think I've seen a case where it's just automatically done that. They're by no means self-enforcing. And what's required, and this is why I said political and public relations are really the crucial component, because what is most necessary, the most necessary ingredient for trying to get someone out of jail is to yell. And it's to get others to yell. And it's to keep that momentum going. And that can be a real challenge, particularly in a world where you have so many countries and so many issues and people being imprisoned all over the place. It's one day you're trying to capture someone's attention on a group of prisoners in Syria, the next day in China, the next day in Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Trying to get people to focus on all those in one day is impossible. And so that is truly the challenge, but that is what has been proven effective. There's a reason why when Dr. Yang Zhanli stood up here and spoke about his own experience, he then mentioned the names of several of his colleagues who are sitting in prison today, because he knows that it's critical to keep naming their names to make sure that we don't forget them. Because it is the individuals, after all, that are driving this fight, and so it's not just the public. It's forums like this are exceptionally important. They're another opportunity to hear so many different stories and to be outraged by so many different events and to speak out. And it's also, there's journalists in the room as well, and it's important that they too take these stories, and that it's not just in the back pages of some specialty media or on a blog. It should be in the Washington Post, it should be in the New York Times, it should be in these papers, because these are really important events and important cases. And so that's one of the primary tools that we fight against these regimes, is we don't shut up. And in some instances, they'll come back and say, well, if you'll just shut up for a few minutes, maybe we will. And that's been tried. That's been tried by human rights groups before, and it doesn't work, because when you're not speaking about it, then they're not having to face it. And when I say speaking about it, it's not just us in the public forums. It's reaching out to our governments, to the United States government, to European governments, and most importantly, to the governments in the neighborhood of the particular country detaining someone. It's critical that they hear it from all sides, that when they sit down, when government officials from China sit down with the Obama administration, that the Obama administration is saying what's happening with the case of Liu Xiaobo, what's happening with Gao Zhizheng, the disappeared lawyer whose wife will speak to all of you tomorrow. That's what's critical. And that's, I know, why we're all here today. And that's honestly what is going to drive change in these countries. So it's my pleasure to be able to speak today about Freedom Now and about the individual stories that we're all here to help reinforce. So thank you.